In a world where power, fear, and corruption are often hidden behind a polished smile, one woman's relentless pursuit of justice is about to expose a dark network that has thrived for far too long. Morgan Blake isn't just fighting for the truth, she's fighting. What happens when a powerful businessman with a hidden agenda thinks he can get away with terrorizing entire communities? When Morgan Blake steps in, everything changes. With the stakes higher than ever, she faces a decision that could break or make her career. Take down a criminal mastermind or watch as his empire continues to destroy innocent lives. As the courtroom battle rages, and with danger closing in, Morgan knows the truth is her only weapon. But will it be enough to bring down a man who's built his empire on fear? Or will the system fail her again? Tune in to discover the shocking twist that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about power, justice, and survival. Don't miss out. This is a story you won't want to skip. Before we dive deeper into this gripping story, if you haven't subscribed to our channel, Epic Story Moments, yet now is the perfect time. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an update, and be the first to hear our incredible new stories. Don't forget to like, share, and comment to support more heartwarming tales like this. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. What happens when a powerful businessman with a hidden agenda thinks he can get away with terrorizing entire communities? When Morgan Blake steps in, everything changes. With the stakes higher than ever, she faces a decision that could break or make her career. Take down a criminal mastermind or watch as his empire continues to destroy innocent lives. As the courtroom battle rages, and with danger closing in, Morgan knows the truth is her only weapon. But will it be enough to bring down a man who's built his empire on fear, or will the system fail her again? Tune in to discover the shocking twist that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about power, justice, and survival. Don't miss out. This is a story you won't want to skip. The sun cast a golden hue across the park, its rays dappling through the branches of swaying trees. Long shadows stretched across the cracked paths, and the sounds of children's laughter mixed with the soft chirping of birds perched nearby. On a solitary bench, tucked at the edge of a peaceful pond, Morgan Blake sat, enjoying the rare tranquility of a quiet afternoon. Her black leather jacket rested beside her on the bench, a subtle reminder of her imposing presence, as it left a faint impression of the strong, muscular frame beneath. A simple gray t-shirt and faded jeans concealed the scars of battles fought in faraway places. A lone scar on her forearm caught the sunlight briefly, the only clue to a past she rarely spoke of. Though she appeared to be simply soaking in the peaceful scene around her, Morgan's eyes never stopped scanning. Years of Navy SEAL training had fine-tuned her instincts, and even now, long after her time in active duty, she couldn't resist the urge to observe her surroundings. A jogger passed, offering a polite nod which she returned, her eyes briefly meeting his. But it wasn't him who caught her attention. Her gaze shifted to a group of teenagers near the playground, their lingering stares betraying their intentions. Nothing about the scene screamed danger, yet the air felt wrong. Something was off. Her trained eyes caught the faint shuffle of a man nearby, unnatural, uneasy, as though he didn't quite belong. And across the park, under the canopy of an old oak tree, she saw them. 4 men loitering in the shadows. Their laughter was harsh and unsettling, a jarring contrast to the peaceful surroundings. The leader, a tall man with broad shoulders, leaned against a tree, scanning the park like a predator searching for prey. Gary Tank. Walker was the last kind of man who could blend into a crowd. His shaved head gleamed under the sun, and a tattoo snaked up his neck, the ink tracing a past that smelled of trouble. He nudged one of his companions, a wiry figure with a patchy beard, and gestured toward Morgan. "That one," Tank muttered, his voice a low growl, dripping with disdain. Sitting there all smug, like she owns the place. Easy pickings. The man with the patchy beard cracked his knuckles, letting out a chuckle. "Bet she won't put up a fight." Tank's smirk deepened. "Oh, I'm sure she'll try. They always do." Morgan felt their eyes on her before she saw them. A prickle of discomfort ran down her spine, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she turned her head slowly, meeting their gaze for a moment. When they didn't look away, she knew what she was dealing with. Trouble, but she kept her posture casual. One arm draped over the back of the bench, the other resting at her side. Her breathing was steady, measured. She let them approach, calculating their moves in the back of her mind. 4 of them, Tank, big and imposing. The second man, slender and wiry. 2 younger men, likely in their 20s, their cocky postures betraying their arrogance. A mix of stale cigarettes and cheap cologne hit the air as they closed the distance. "All right, gentlemen," Morgan thought to herself with a quiet smile. "Let's see what you've got." The group's conversation grew louder as they made their way across the park, their laughter ringing through the air. It wasn't a laugh of mirth, but one of superiority. Tank led the charge, his movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. The others flanked him, spreading out like wolves closing in on a lone deer. Morgan didn't flinch. Instead, she shifted slightly, making herself appear vulnerable, just enough to bait them into thinking they had the upper hand. Her instincts were sharp. These men weren't used to facing resistance. They hunted easy prey, relying on intimidation and fear. What they didn't know was that they had just picked the wrong target. Tank stopped in front of her, his boots crunching against the gravel as he stood tall, his smug smile only widening. The others closed in, their excitement barely contained. "Afternoon, ma'am," Tank said, his voice dripping with mock politeness. "Mighty nice day to be sitting out here all alone, don't you think?" Morgan's eyes narrowed slightly, her calm expression unwavering. She met his gaze coolly, unbothered by the taunt. "It's a fine day," she replied evenly. "What do you want?" Tank chuckled and glanced back at his crew. "Now, that's no way to greet friendly folks just out for a chat. You got something against a few good old boys stopping to say hi." Patchy Beard leaned in closer, his grin revealing yellowed teeth. "Or maybe she's just one of those types." Tank, thinking she's too good to talk to the likes of us. Morgan didn't respond, her gaze flicking between them, calculating. They were close now, too close. She could feel the tension rising in the air, thick and palpable. Any sudden movement could set things off. She was waiting for the first sign, the first move. "You hear me, lady?" Patchy Beard sneered, his voice sharp. "Think you're better than us?" One of the younger men, sunburned and smug, sneered at her. "Bet she's one of those uppity ones, thinking this part belongs to her kind now." Morgan's jaw tightened, but her voice remained steady. "I don't think anything belongs to me. I'm just sitting here, minding my business." Tank raised an eyebrow, his tone now more condescending. "You hear that, boys? She's just minding her business. Guess we'll mind it for her." He pointed at her bag resting beside her on the bench. "Nice bag you've got there. Bet it's got something good in it. Why don't you be polite and hand it over? We wouldn't want things to get messy." Morgan's lips twitched into the faintest of smiles, her eyes locking onto Tank's. "Is that what you call polite these days? Stealing from people who look like me?" The smile dropped from Tank's face. His voice darkened, now laced with anger. "What's that supposed to mean?" Morgan's eyes never wavered. "You didn't pick me because I'm alone. You picked me because you think I'm an easy target." One of the younger men stepped forward, his voice rising with anger. "You got a mouth on you, huh? Probably the same one you use to cry racism every time things don't go your way." Morgan stood, her movements slow and deliberate, though shorter than Tank. She carried herself with an air of quiet authority, her presence growing as she shifted from seated to standing. The men froze, taken aback by her sudden shift. "You really think this is going to go the way you planned?" she asked softly, her tone laced with challenge. "Walk away while you still can." Patchy Beard laughed, but it was nervous, uncertain. "Look at her, trying to play tough. What are you going to do, lady? Call the cops? Like they'd show up for someone like you." Tank stepped forward, his expression darkening. The air between them crackled with tension, thick with the unspoken promise of violence. "I don't think you're listening, lady," Tank growled, his voice venomous. "We take that bag, and maybe we take something else too." Morgan's heart rate quickened, not from fear, but from the anticipation of what was to come. Her SEAL training kicked in. Her mind assessed every angle, every potential escape route, every weakness in their formation. She'd faced far worse than this, and she wasn't about to let these men think they could intimidate her. Her hands rested at her sides, deceptively relaxed. She knew what she needed to do. The moment they made their move, she would be ready. Tank leaned in, his voice low and menacing. "This ain't a game, lady. Give us the bag, or we'll show you what happens when you don't respect your betters." Morgan's gaze never wavered. Her voice was calm, steel-like. "You're going to regret this." Her grip tightened on her bag strap. She stood tall, her body tense but her expression calm. The men watched her, their sneers full of arrogance, expecting her to cower. But Morgan didn't flinch. Without warning, she turned, taking a single, confident step forward. Her steps were measured, her breathing controlled, though her pulse quickened. She had no intention of running. It would only embolden them. But she wasn't about to stand there and give them the satisfaction of a response. Behind her, their voices rose, taunting and louder now, like a pack of jackals circling their prey. "Hey, where are you going?" one of the younger men called, his voice carrying an edge of mockery. "We ain't done talking, lady." Morgan ignored him, keeping her pace steady as she scanned for an exit. The park's main thoroughfare was ahead, but the tree-lined path she had chosen felt suddenly too quiet, too far removed from the safety of crowds. The crunch of their footsteps on gravel grew louder, closer. Her jaw tightened. "Come on now, don't be like that patchy beard. Jared, ain't you used to folks like us talking to you, or you too good for that?" Morgan clenched her teeth, fighting the urge to look back. She rounded a corner and stopped abruptly when she realized her mistake. The clearing ahead was wide and open, but they had moved faster than she expected. They blocked the path now, spreading out in a loose semicircle. Tank stood in the center, his broad shoulders squared, his smug grin daring her to make a move. Patchy Beard was at his side, cracking his knuckles, while the two younger men flanked them, leaning casually against trees as if they had all the time in the world. "Well now," Tank drawled, his tone dripping with mock politeness. "Look at you all cornered. But you didn't think this one through, did you?" Morgan turned to glance behind her, but one of the younger men had circled back, cutting off her escape route. She was boxed in, her eyes flicked between them, reading their stances, their movements. Her body was calm, but her mind was racing. There was no reasoning with them, not with men like these. Tank took a step forward, his grin widening. "You lost, sweetheart. This ain't your part of town." Morgan met his gaze, her voice calm but cold. "I'm not lost. Now, if you'll move, I'll be on my way." Patchy Beard chuckled, stepping closer. "Oh, you think you can just walk away? Like we're just gonna let you? Nah, lady, you don't get it. This ain't a free ride for your kind." Morgan's jaw tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. "I don't want any trouble." "Oh, we know you don't," Tank sneered. "People like you never do. Just want to sit there all smug, acting like you belong, like you can just take up space like the rest of us. But see, that's the thing, you don't." One of the younger men pushed off the tree, pointing at Morgan with an accusing finger. "She thinks she's better than us. You see it, right? The way she looks at us, like she's too good. Probably one of those types who cries racism every time something doesn't go her way." "Yeah," Patchy Beard added, his voice sharpening. "Bet she's had it easy her whole life. Probably never worked a day for nothing. Everything handed to her. Just cause of some pity sob story." Morgan exhaled sharply, her patience wearing thin. "You don't know anything about me. Tank's smirk turned into a sneer. Oh, I know enough. You're just like the rest of them. Always looking for a handout. Always expecting everyone else to step aside. Well, guess what? Not today. Morgan shifted slightly, adjusting her stance. Her calm, steely gaze didn't waver. I've already warned you. Walk away. And this ends here. Patchy Beard threw his head back in laughter. Warn us? Listen to her. Tank. Thinks she's in charge here. Tank growled, his tone darkening. You're going to hand over that bag, and maybe, just maybe, we'll let you walk out of here without a bruise. Morgan scanned their faces, her instincts kicking in. These men weren't here for her bag. That was just the excuse. This was about power, about making her feel small. They wanted her to submit. They wanted to show. She stood her ground, her voice steady and sharp. You've had your chance. Before she could finish her sentence, one of the younger men lunged at her. Morgan sidestepped smoothly, her movements quick and precise. She didn't strike, not yet. Her instincts told her to act fast and decisively, but she needed them to cross the line fully. Tank's face twisted with rage as he barked. What are you waiting for? Get her. The order hung in the air for only a second before the younger man lunged again, this time with more force. Morgan moved instinctively, stepping aside and grabbing his arm in one fluid motion, using his momentum against him. She twisted sharply, sending him sprawling to the ground with a yelp. He groaned, clutching his arm as he rolled onto his side, momentarily out of the fight. The group froze for a beat, their faces shifting from smug confidence to shocked disbelief. Morgan turned her attention to the rest of them, her stance calm but unyielding. She adjusted the strap of her bag over her shoulder, her eyes narrowing. I told you to walk away. Patchy Beard sneered, though there was hesitation in his movements now. Oh, you're gonna regret that, lady. Tank stepped forward, his imposing frame towering over her. Think you're tough, huh? We'll see how long that lasts. He swung at her, a wide, uncoordinated blow meant to overwhelm rather than connect. Morgan ducked easily, her movements smooth and practiced. She drove her elbow into his ribs as she rose, forcing him to stumble back, his breath hitching. He clutched his side, his face contorting with pain and anger. Come on, all of you, Tank barked, motioning for the others. Take her down. Morgan's muscles tensed as the remaining men closed in. Patchy Beard moved first, his fists raised, swinging wildly at her. She deflected his strikes with precision, her movements economical and deliberate. A sharp kick to his knee sent him reeling, his balance faltering just enough for Morgan to shove him backward. He hit the ground with a thud, cursing loudly. The younger man who had been leaning against the tree rushed her next, his approach more cautious but no less aggressive. Morgan stepped into his attack, blocking his swing and driving her palm into his chest. The impact forced him to stumble back, gasping for air, but he managed to stay on his feet. He glared at her, his face red with exertion. You're going to pay for that, he growled, circling her wearily. Morgan didn't respond. Her eyes stayed locked on him, her body poised to react. She felt the familiar burn of adrenaline coursing through her veins, her focus razor-sharp. This wasn't just a fight. It was survival. Tank recovered and advanced again, his movements slower but more deliberate this time. You think you're some kind of hero? He spat. You think you can walk into our park and show us up? Morgan turned to face him fully, her voice calm but firm. This isn't your park, and I'm not the one showing anyone up. You've done that to yourselves. Her words only seemed to enrage him further. He feinted left, then threw a punch aimed at her head. Morgan ducked and countered with a swift strike to his torso, followed by a low kick to his shin. Tank stumbled but stayed upright, his fist swinging again, more out of frustration than strategy. Morgan sidestepped effortlessly, forcing him to overextend and lose balance. Come on, Tank! Patchy Beard shouted, struggling to his feet. Stop playing around. Morgan caught movement in her periphery and turned just in time to block an attack from one of the younger men. He had grabbed a tree branch, swinging it like a bat, but Morgan stepped inside his reach, twisted it out of his hands, and with a quick shove, sent him stumbling backward. He tripped over his own feet and landed hard on the gravel path. Tank roared in frustration, charging at her with everything he had. This time, Morgan let him come closer, stepping aside at the last second and using his momentum to drive him into a nearby tree. The impact was solid and Tank staggered, clutching the bark for support as he tried to regain his footing. Patchy Beard, emboldened by her brief distraction, lunged at her from behind. Morgan felt his presence and spun, catching him mid-charge. She delivered a sharp elbow strike to his chest, followed by a push that sent him crashing to the ground once again. The fight was chaotic and relentless, but Morgan's movements were precise, her training evident in every calculated strike. Still, she wasn't unscathed. Her ribs ached from a poorly blocked punch, and her forearm throbbed where the younger man's branch had grazed her. But she pushed the pain aside, her focus unbroken. Tank stumbled back into the clearing, his face twisted in fury. "You think this is over?" he snarled. Morgan straightened, her breathing steady despite the effort she'd exerted. "No," she said, her tone ice cold. "You're the one who's going to regret it." The remaining men, bruised and battered, exchanged uncertain glances. Patchy Beard was slow to rise, his confidence visibly shaken. One of the younger men backed away, muttering something under his breath about it not being worth it. But Tank wasn't done. His pride and ego wouldn't let him back down. "You think you've won?" he spat. "You don't know what you've started." Morgan's eyes narrowed. "Then let's finish it." But before either of them could move, a distant sound pierced attention. The faint wail of approaching sirens. The gang's head snapped toward the sound, their expressions shifting from anger to uncertainty. Tank's eyes narrowed, his mind racing to decide whether his pride was worth the risk of getting caught. "You hear that?" one of the younger men muttered, taking a cautious step back. "Cops are coming." "So what?" Tank barked, his voice rising in frustration. "We're not done here." Patchy Beard wasn't so sure. He shifted his weight uncomfortably, glancing at Tank. "Look, man, this ain't worth it." "Shut up," Tank growled, pointing a finger at him. "We don't run. We finish this." Morgan stood her ground, her breathing even despite the ache spreading through her ribs. She could see the fractures forming in their unity, the cracks in the facade of confidence that had emboldened them earlier. The sirens grew louder, closer, a promise of intervention that the gang couldn't ignore. "Tank," the younger man said again, his voice more urgent. "She's not worth it. Let's go." Tank turned back to Morgan, his eyes blazing with rage and frustration. He took a step toward her, his fists trembling at his sides. For a moment, it looked like he might push forward, consequences be damned. But then the sirens gave a sharp rising wail. Close enough now that the red and blue flashes of police lights became visible through the trees. "Damn it," Tank cursed, his voice cracking with anger. He shot Morgan a venomous glare. "This ain't over." Morgan's voice was cold and precise. "Yes, it is." With a growl of frustration, Tank turned on his heel, motioning for the others to follow. "Let's go. Move." Patchy Beard didn't hesitate, limping after Tank with a grim expression. The younger men exchanged one last glance at Morgan, their faces a mixture of anger and unease, before trailing after their leader. One of them muttered under his breath, "She's crazy." As they disappeared into the shadows of the tree line, Morgan stayed rooted in place, her body still coiled with tension. Her ears tracked the fading sound of their footsteps, her eyes scanning the clearing to make sure none of them doubled back. Only when she was certain they were gone did she allow herself to exhale. The sirens were nearly upon her now, the crunch of tires on gravel signaling the arrival of law enforcement. 2 squad cars pulled to a stop at the edge of the clearing, their lights painting the trees in bursts of red and blue. The officers stepped out cautiously, their hands resting on their belts as they surveyed the scene. One of them, a tall man with a clipped tone of authority, approached her. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked. "We got a call about a disturbance in the park." Morgan nodded, keeping her tone even. "I'm fine. They're gone now." The officer's eyes lingered on her for a moment, noting the scrape on her arm and the subtle shift in her stance that betrayed the pain she was masking. "Did they hurt you?" Morgan shook her head. "Nothing I can't handle." Another officer scanned the area, noticing the disturbed dirt and a few items left behind. One of the younger men's hats, a discarded stick. He turned back toward his partner. "Looks like they ran in a hurry." The first officer sighed, pulling out a notepad. "Can you describe them?" Morgan hesitated, her mind racing through the events of the past several minutes. She could feel the adrenaline beginning to ebb, replaced by the dull ache of bruises and the sharp sting of her arm. 4 of them, mid-20s mostly. The leader, tall, shaved head, tattoos on his neck. Calls himself Tank. The officer nodded, jotting down her words. "Did they say anything? Anything to suggest why they targeted you?" Morgan's jaw tightened. She could still hear their words echoing in her head. The mocking tone, the slurs, the hatred barely disguised as bravado. She chose her words carefully. It wasn't random. They knew what they were doing. The officer's pen hovered over the page, his brow furrowing. Meaning? Morgan met his gaze evenly. Meaning they've done this before, and they'll do it again. The officer's expression hardened as he finished taking notes. "We'll keep an eye out for them. In the meantime, we'd like you to come down to the station and file a formal report." Morgan nodded slowly. "I'll meet you there." As the officers returned to their vehicles, Morgan took a moment to steady herself. The clearing was quiet again, but the weight of what had just happened lingered heavily in the air. This wasn't over. Tank's parting words weren't just a threat, they were a challenge. And Morgan had no intention of backing down. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed faintly overhead as Morgan sat in a chair across from Officer Reyes, her expression calm, but her body still thrumming with adrenaline. The confrontation at the park was over, but the weight of the men's words lingered, their hateful intent unmistakable. She replayed the encounter in her mind. Not just a physical fight, but the taunts, the sneers, and the pointed reminders of why they had chosen her as their target. Reyes, a young officer with a no-nonsense demeanor, flipped open his notebook. "Let's start from the top, Miss Blake. You said there were 4 men. You mentioned their leader calls himself Tank. Can you walk me through exactly what happened?" Morgan recounted the events in sharp, precise detail. Their mocking tone, the hateful comments, the way they surrounded her like a pack of wolves. Reyes's pen moved quickly across the page, his expression growing darker as her story unfolded. When she finished, he tapped the pen against his notebook thoughtfully. "This doesn't sound random. You're sure you've never seen these men before?" "I'm sure," Morgan replied. "They weren't after my bag. That was just an excuse. They saw me sitting alone, and they thought they could intimidate me. They wanted me to feel out of place." Reyes frowned, leaning back in his chair. "Why do you think they singled you out?" Morgan didn't hesitate. "Because I'm black." Reyes's pen froze midair. "They said that." Morgan's jaw tightened. Not directly at first, but it was clear in everything they said. They made it obvious. Comments about me thinking I'm better than them. How people like me don't belong. This wasn't just about stealing something. They wanted me to feel small. Reyes sighed, closing his notebook with a faint snap. "We've had reports of harassment like this recently. Minor incidents in public spaces, mostly. But if this group is targeting people based on race..." He trailed off, frustration visible. "They are," Morgan said firmly. "And they've been doing it for a while. They were too comfortable, too confident. This wasn't their first time." Reyes leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "I'll run their descriptions through the system and cross-reference any recent reports, but I'll be honest with you, Miss Blake. Cases like this are hard to pin down. If victims don't press charges, or if there's no solid evidence, it's tough to build a case. Morgan's voice was sharp. Then find the evidence, because I'm not letting this slide. Hours later, Morgan sat in her living room, her laptop casting a faint glow as she scrolled through local news reports. She wasn't the type to sit back and hope for the best. Her military training had taught her to take initiative, and if Reyes needed more proof, she'd find it. It didn't take long to notice a disturbing pattern. In the past 6 months, there had been multiple reports of harassment and minor assaults across the area, all involving groups of men targeting individuals in public spaces. In every case, the victims were people of color. Morgan's jaw clenched as she read through the accounts. The descriptions of the attackers were consistent. A tall, broad-shouldered man with tattoos on his neck, flanked by younger men. Tanked. Many of the victims hadn't pressed charges, likely out of fear or frustration with the system, but their accounts all echoed the same sentiment. The attacks weren't just about theft. They were meant to send a message. As she dug deeper, Morgan came across a community forum discussing similar incidents. One thread in particular stood out. These guys aren't just random thugs. They target minorities. They pick their spots, intimidate people, and get out fast. Nobody ever catches them. Her phone buzzed on the table, breaking her concentration. It was a message from Sarah Carter, her best friend and a journalist known for chasing stories others avoided. Heard about what happened. You okay? Call me. Morgan didn't hesitate. She hit the call button, and Sarah picked up on the first ring. Morgan, I saw the news. What happened? Morgan replayed the encounter in her mind. Not just a physical confrontation, but the taunts, sneers, and the chilling reminder of why they had targeted her. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. They had wanted her to feel small, insignificant. She couldn't shake the images of the men surrounding her, their eyes full of hatred. Tank had led them, a towering figure whose presence alone was enough to intimidate. Morgan had felt the weight of their hostility. Reyes, a young officer with a no-nonsense attitude, sat across from her at the station. He flipped open his notebook, his gaze unwavering. Let's start from the top, Miss Blake. You said there were 4 men. The leader calls himself Tank. Can you walk me through exactly what happened? Morgan's voice was steady as she recounted the events, each word sharp, precise. She described their mocking tones, the way they circled her like predators. Reyes's pen moved quickly, scribbling down notes. His expression grew darker with each detail she revealed. When she finished, he tapped the pen against his notebook thoughtfully. This doesn't sound random. You're sure you've never seen these men before? I'm sure, Morgan replied, her tone resolute. They weren't after my bag. That was just a cover. They saw me sitting alone and decided to make me their target. They wanted me to feel out of place. Reyes leaned back in his chair, his frown deepening. Why do you think they singled you out? Morgan didn't hesitate, her voice clear. Because I'm black. Reyes's pen froze midair, his eyes lifting to meet hers. They said that. Morgan's jaw tightened. Not directly at first, but it was clear in everything they said. Comments about how people like me don't belong, how I think I'm better than them. It wasn't about stealing anything. It was about making me feel small. Reyes closed his notebook with a soft snap, frustration evident on his face. We've had reports of incidents like this recently. Minor harassment in public spaces, mostly. But if they're targeting people based on race... He trailed off, a deep sigh escaping him. They are, Morgan said firmly, her voice unwavering. And they've been doing it for a while. They were too comfortable, too confident. This wasn't their first time. Reyes leaned forward, his brow furrowing as he studied her. I'll run their descriptions through the system, cross-reference with recent reports. But I'll be honest with you, Miss Blake. Cases like this are tough. If victims don't press charges, or if there's no solid evidence, it's hard to build a case. Morgan's tone sharpened. Then find the evidence. Because I'm not letting this go. Hours later, Morgan sat in her living room, her laptop casting a faint glow in the dimly lit room. She wasn't one to wait for things to happen. She took control. Her military training had taught her that if Reyes needed more proof, she would find it herself. It didn't take long before a disturbing pattern emerged. In the past 6 months, there had been multiple reports of harassment and minor assaults in the area, all involving groups of men targeting people of color. The descriptions of the attackers were eerily consistent. A tall, broad-shouldered man with tattoos on his neck, flanked by younger men. Tank. It all lined up. Many of the victims hadn't pressed charges, likely out of fear or frustration with the system. But the accounts echoed the same disturbing truth. These attacks weren't random. They were messages. As she dug deeper, Morgan stumbled upon a community formed discussing similar incidents. One thread caught her attention. These guys aren't just random thugs. They target minorities. They pick their spots, intimidate people, and get out fast. No one ever catches them. Her phone buzzed on the table, breaking her concentration. It was a message from Sarah Carter, her best friend and a journalist who always chased the stories others ignored. Heard about what happened. You okay? Call me. Without a second thought, Morgan hit the call button. Sarah picked up immediately. Morgan, I saw the news. What happened? Morgan knew she was putting herself in immediate danger, but she was resolute. Reaching into her pocket, she pulled out her phone and quickly typed a message to Sarah. Found him. Warehouse on Fletcher. Call Reyes now. As she hit send, her stance adjusted, preparing for whatever came next. She wasn't leaving without answers, but she wasn't reckless enough to take on Tank and his crew alone. The sirens had bought her time at the park, but this time, she needed more than just luck to win. Morgan's voice broke the tense silence in the warehouse. Tank, the room froze, and every head snapped toward her. Tank's eyes narrowed as he stepped forward, his face darkening with recognition. You're Morgan? His voice was thick with disdain, a smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. Morgan straightened, her expression calm, but her gaze sharp. We're going to have a conversation. Tank laughed, the sound low and menacing. You think you can just walk in here and start making demands? Morgan's tone turned cold as steel. I think you're going to tell me everything I want to know, because if you don't, this place will be swarming with cops in less than 5 minutes. Tank's smirk faltered just for a moment, but he quickly recovered. You don't scare me. Morgan stepped closer, her presence unyielding. You should be. The tension in the room was palpable as Tank's crew exchanged uneasy glances. Their earlier bravado was fading under the weight of Morgan's calm, unyielding presence. You've got guts, Tank said, his voice strained as he tried to maintain control. But guts don't mean much when you're outnumbered. Morgan's sharp gaze swept the room, counting the men, 5 in total, including Tank. Her expression didn't waver. Outnumbered? I've seen worse odds. And guess what? They didn't win either. Tank's fists clenched at his sides, his anger simmering beneath the surface. Big talk. You think you're some kind of hero? No, Morgan replied coldly. I'm just the one who's going to make sure you answer for what you've done. Before Tank could respond, the faint wail of police sirens reached the warehouse. The sound grew louder, the flashing blue and red lights casting shifting shadows across the grimy walls. Tank froze, his smirk finally slipping into genuine alarm. You called the cops? One of his crew members, Patchy Beard, spat, his voice rising in panic. He looked toward the exit, his instincts screaming at him to run. Morgan's voice was firm as steel. You think I came here without a plan? It's over. Don't let her scare you, Tank barked, his voice cracking under the weight of his own uncertainty. We've handled worse than this. Have you? Morgan asked, stepping forward. Because from where I'm standing, you're about to lose everything. The sound of tires crunching on gravel outside was followed by slamming car doors and muffled voices of approaching officers. Tank's crew shifted uneasily, looking to their leader for direction. but even Tank seemed momentarily at a loss. One of the younger men whispered urgently, "Tank, what do we do?" Tank turned on him, his face twisted in frustration. "Shut up and stay put. We're not running." Morgan's voice cut through the rising chaos. "You don't have to run, but you will face the consequences." Finally, Patchy Beard broke under the pressure. Bolting toward the back exit, Morgan moved like lightning, intercepting him before he could reach the door. She grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back with practiced precision, forcing him to his knees. He yelped, his bravado crumbling into panic. "You're not going anywhere," Morgan said evenly, her grip firm. Tank and the others stared, their hesitation giving the officers outside enough time to act. The front doors burst open and a team of uniformed police stormed in, their weapons drawn, their voices commanding. "Police, hands in the air." Tank's face twisted in rage, but he raised his hands reluctantly. The younger men followed suit, their fear outweighing their loyalty to their leader. Within moments, the officers moved in quickly, restraining the group and placing them in handcuffs. Morgan released Patchy Beard, stepping back as an officer took over. She straightened, her sharp gaze still fixed on Tank as he was cuffed and pulled to his feet. "You think this changes anything?" Tank snarled at her, his bravado now hollow. Morgan stepped closer, her voice low enough for only him to hear. "You're done. The people you've hurt, the fear you've spread, it ends here. And if there's anyone above you, I'll find them too." Tank glared at her as the officers led him and his crew out of the warehouse, their voices fading as they were escorted to waiting squad cars. Officer Reyes approached Morgan, his expression a mix of relief and respect. "You weren't kidding when you said you'd bring us something concrete." Morgan crossed her arms, her posture unwavering. "You've got them now. Don't let them slip through the cracks." Reyes nodded. "We'll make sure they don't. You've done more than your part here, Blake." Morgan didn't respond immediately. Her eyes lingered on the warehouse, the echoes of the confrontation still fresh in her mind. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady but determined. "This isn't over. Tank's just a piece of the puzzle. There's someone bigger pulling the strings, and I'm going to find them." Reyes frowned. "We'll do what we can, but don't go after them alone. You've already done enough." Morgan gave him a small, cold smile. "We both know I don't stop halfway." As the officers finished clearing the scene, Morgan turned and walked away, the faint chill of the night air brushing against her face. Tank and his crew were in custody, but the battle wasn't over. This was just the beginning, and she was ready for whatever came next. The dim light from Morgan's laptop flickered across her face as she leaned forward, her fingers tapping quickly across the keyboard. It was well past midnight, but the adrenaline from Tank's capture still coursed through her veins. The warehouse bust had given her and the authorities a solid win, but she knew it was just a piece of the puzzle. Tank's operations weren't isolated. They were part of something bigger, and she needed to know who was pulling the strings. Across from her, Sarah sat cross-legged on the couch, scrolling through a series of documents on her tablet. Her usual sharp wit was dulled by exhaustion, but the determination in her eyes mirrored Morgan's. "So, Reyes confirmed they're keeping Tank and holding for now," Sarah said. "But if they don't get something concrete to charge him with, he'll lawyer up and walk. We can't let that happen." "He's not walking," Morgan said firmly. "Not if we can prove he's tied to the larger network." Sarah frowned, pausing mid-scroll. "It's not going to be easy. These groups are careful. They keep their operations decentralized, so no one person has all the answers. That's why we focus on Tank," Morgan replied. "He knows more than he's letting on. We just need to make him talk." Sarah hesitated, her brows furrowing. "And if he doesn't?" Morgan leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Then we find another way. Someone else in his crew knows something. Patchy Beard, one of the younger guys, they're followers, not leaders. They'll crack before he does." The next morning, Morgan met Reyes at the police station. The atmosphere was tense. the faint buzz of ringing phones and murmured conversations filling the air. Reyes led her down a quiet hallway to the interrogation rooms. "Tank's in there," Reyes said, nodding toward a door with a small observation window. "He hasn't said much since last night. Just a lot of posturing." Morgan folded her arms. "Let me talk to him." Reyes hesitated, his expression skeptical. "You sure? He's the type who will try to get under your skin." Morgan's gaze didn't waver. "He can try. It won't work." Reyes opened the door, and Morgan stepped inside. Tank sat at the metal table, his broad shoulders hunched as he stared across at her. Connections, locations, and key figures tied to Paul Hendrick's operations. The documents scattered across the table painted a clearer picture of the complex web of corruption that had been operating under the guise of legitimate business. Morgan's fingers drummed on the edge of the table as she absorbed the new information. Reyes stood at the whiteboard, marker in hand, detailing the next steps. "We've got enough to start taking down Hendrick's network," he said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "But we can't afford to let anyone slip through the cracks." Sarah, still scanning through her tablet, looked up. "The shell companies, the donations, all of it is connected to political groups and causes that are getting funding from Hendrick's accounts. If we move on this fast, we might be able to stop the next wave of operations before it starts." Morgan's expression hardened. She was more determined than ever, but the stakes were higher now. Taking Hendrick down wasn't just about stopping him. It was about dismantling everything he had built. "We can't just arrest the men. We have to take away their ability to fund and mobilize. This isn't going to be over until we shut down every aspect of their operation." Reyes nodded, agreed. "We're looking at a massive sting operation across several states. The people involved are dangerous, and Hendrick's reach goes far beyond this city." Morgan shifted her focus back to the map, studying the locations and names marked in red. Hendrick wasn't just a local problem. His influence spread like wildfire, and he had allies everywhere. "Let's make sure we're ready," she said, her voice low and filled with resolve. "When we move on him, we go all in. No one gets left standing." As the team continued to plan the next steps, the tension in the room was palpable. Everyone knew the risks involved, but Morgan was unshaken. This was a fight she had been preparing for. Hendrick's empire was crumbling, and Morgan was the one holding the wrecking ball. The rest of the team filed out, their faces grim but hopeful, as they went to prepare for the raids and operations that would follow. Morgan stayed behind, watching the map and mentally running through every detail, every risk, every plan. The moment to strike was nearing, but in the back of her mind, she knew that taking down Hendrick was only one part of the puzzle. His network was vast, and there would always be someone else ready to take his place. But for now, this was a victory that would bring justice to all those hurt by Hendrick's actions. Morgan stood up, her mind set on the next challenge. She wasn't done yet. To Hendrick, "You're not as untouchable as you think." Tank's eyes flicked to the arrest report, his jaw tightening as he processed the information. His fingers drummed nervously on the table, but he kept his face neutral, unwilling to show any weakness. "You think you can turn me into one of your snitches?" he spat, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm not like those kids you've got locked up. They're scared, but I'm not. I'll die before I roll over." Morgan leaned in, her voice cold but persuasive. "You're already dead, Tank. You're just too blind to see it. You're a liability to Hendrick now, and he'll toss you aside as soon as you stop being useful. Those kids you're protecting, they're already singing, and once they're out of the way, Hendrick won't care about you either." Tank's expression faltered for the briefest moment. It was a crack in his armor, a sign that Morgan's words were cutting through the bravado he had built up. But it was only for a second before he leaned back in his chair, trying to regain control. "You're bluffing," he said, his voice hoarse but trying to sound confident. "Hendrick won't let you take me down. You've got nothing on him." Morgan didn't flinch. "We've got enough to bring him down, but we need you to connect the last dots." You're not getting out of here unless you cooperate, Tank. Help us, and we'll make sure you don't go down alone. We're offering you a way out. All you have to do is talk." For a long moment, Tank didn't respond. His gaze was fixed on the table, his mind working, the weight of his options pressing down on him. Morgan's patience was unwavering as she waited for him to crack. Finally, Tank let out a deep sigh, his shoulders sagging. "You don't get it," he muttered. "Hendrick's got people everywhere. You can't touch him. But you're right. He doesn't give a damn about any of us. He uses us. Always has." Morgan pressed on, sensing he was weakening. "Who else is involved, Tank? Who's really pulling the strings?" Tank hesitated, then nodded toward the folder Morgan had slid in front of him. "Kane. Thomas Kane's the one who runs the show behind the scenes. He's the one keeping everything organized, money transfers, the logistics. Hendrick's the face, but Kane's the real power." Reyes stood up, his expression intense. "And where can we find him?" Tank's eyes flicked toward the door, and for a moment, Morgan thought he wasn't going to answer. But then he leaned forward, his voice low, almost resigned. "Kane's always with Hendrick. They've been meeting a lot lately. If you're going to take them down, that's where you need to hit." Morgan exchanged a look with Reyes. This was the break they needed. The pieces were falling into place, and they were closer than ever to taking down Hendrick and dismantling his operation. She stood up, looking down at Tank, whose eyes had shifted from defiance to a mixture of fear and acceptance. "You made the right choice, Tank. We'll make sure you're protected, but remember, you're not out of the woods yet. Keep your end of the deal, and we'll keep ours." As she and Reyes walked out of the interrogation room, the weight of what lay ahead settled over them. They had Kane's name, they had the connection to Hendrick, and now they had the momentum to finish what they'd started. But even as the walls of Hendrick's empire began to close in, Morgan knew the real battle was only just beginning. The deeper they dug, the more dangerous this operation was going to become. But she was ready. She had to be. Hendrick's network was vast, but Morgan was determined to tear it all down, piece by piece. The trial stretched on, the weight of the evidence mounting with every passing day. Tank's testimony had already started to shift the momentum in the prosecution's favor. But Morgan knew that Hendrick was far from defeated. He had the resources, the connections, and the cunning to turn the tide if they let their guard down. As the defense continued to chip away at Tank's credibility, the prosecution had to lean on the airtight case they had built. Sarah's financial analysis had left little room for doubt. The money trail was clear. Payments flowing from Hendrick's companies to shell accounts that funded Tank's crew and other groups under his thumb. The weapons, the materials, the graffiti supplies. It all pointed back to Hendrick. But it wasn't just the money that tied Hendrick to the crimes. The intercepted communications between his associates and the burner phones used by the crews were damning. The coded language they used in their conversations, the way they referred to their actions as restoring community integrity and preserving tradition, all spoke volumes when combined with the financial records. It wasn't just a matter of hate crimes. It was an entire network of intimidation, violence, and control that Hendrick had built over the years. During the trial, Morgan sat in the back of the courtroom, watching Hendrick closely. He exuded confidence, his expensive suit and calm demeanor, giving off an air of control. But Morgan could see through the facade. She noticed the subtle twitch in his jaw, the way his eyes constantly flicked to his lawyers as they attempted to discredit the case. Hendrick knew the walls were closing in on him. Tank's testimony had been crucial. Despite his nerves, he had told the truth, detailing everything from the money exchanges to the unspoken understanding that Hendrick was the mastermind behind it all. The defense did everything they could to undermine him, highlighting his criminal record and plea deal. But the prosecution's evidence countered every argument they raised. Morgan knew that their case was strong, but she also knew that the defense would fight tooth and nail to protect their client. Hendrick was powerful, and his defense team was just as determined to keep him free. The real challenge lay in making sure every piece of evidence stuck, and showing the jury that Hendrick's empire of fear and violence was not only real, but it had been sustained by him for years. As the trial moved toward its final days, Morgan sat in the precinct, reviewing the final pieces of their case. The pressure was mounting, but she was determined to see it through. Hendrick had taken so much from so many people, and now it was time to make him answer for it. The team had done their part. They had exposed his network, gathered the evidence, and got Tank to testify. Now, all they had to do was ensure that the jury saw what they had uncovered. The final arguments came, and it felt like the entire weight of the investigation had been distilled into a few final moments. The prosecution's argument was clear. Hendrick was the mastermind, the one pulling the strings behind the hate groups, the intimidation, and the violence. They had proof in the form of financial records, communications, and Tank's testimony. The defense fought back hard, but they were on shaky ground. Hendrick's ability to distance himself from the crimes was unraveling. Morgan watched as the jury filed back into Courtroom. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest. This was a moment. Hendrick's fate was in their hands. The jury deliberated for what felt like hours. Morgan didn't dare look at the clock. The uncertainty of it all was almost too much to bear. But finally, the foreperson stood and read the verdict. Guilty. A wave of relief washed over Morgan, but it was short-lived. Hendrick's conviction was a victory, but it wasn't just about him. It was about the lives that had been ruined, the communities that had been terrorized. Morgan knew that there was still more work to be done. Hendrick's conviction was just the first step. The network he had built needed to be torn down, and the people he had used needed to be held accountable. As she walked out of the courtroom, Reyes by her side, Morgan knew that they had taken down one of the most dangerous men she had ever faced. But the war was far from over. Hendrick was only the beginning. There were more like him, more networks to expose, more lives to save, and Morgan was ready to keep fighting. Satisfied as he approached them, "This is a big win," he said, his voice steady despite the exhaustion in his eyes. Hendrick's conviction is going to send a message, not just to him, but to anyone else who thinks they can hide behind money and power. Morgan nodded, her gaze fixed on the bustling scene in front of her. The reporters were clamoring for interviews, the cameras flashing, but Morgan felt detached from it all. This wasn't about the media attention. It was about the people who had suffered because of Hendrick and his network. It was about taking down the system that allowed men like him to thrive. "It's not over," Morgan said, her voice quiet but firm. "Hendrick may be behind bars, but the people who helped him, they're still out there. And the network, it's still intact." Sarah's smile faded, replaced by a look of determination. "We'll get them, too. You've already brought down one of the worst. We're just getting started." Reyes stepped in, his hands in his pockets, looking more contemplative than celebratory. "We've exposed a fraction of what Hendrick was running, but this case has given us the foundation to bring down the rest. It's not going to be easy, but we've got the evidence, and we've got the momentum." Morgan looked back at the courthouse doors. Inside, the final motions were being made, Hendrick's fate about to be sealed for good. But the work that remained, tracking down the rest of his network, dismantling the operations, was just beginning. "I'm not stopping," Morgan said, her voice steady now, the weight of the moment settling in. "We have to finish what we started. For everyone who's been affected by what he did." Sarah clapped her on the shoulder. "You've got this. We've got this." As they turned to leave, Morgan felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey wasn't over. Hendrick's conviction was a victory, but it was only the first step in a long fight. The real work, tearing down the network, bringing justice to the victims, and making sure that no one could operate in the shadows like Hendrick had done, was still ahead. But Morgan was ready. With her team by her side, she knew they could handle whatever came next. Morgan sat back on the bench, the weight of the day settling into her bones. The world around her seemed to slow, the noise of the city becoming a distant hum. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of peace, brief, fleeting, but there nonetheless. The fight had taken everything from her, but today had been a step forward. Hendrick was going to prison. his empire of fear shattered, and for the first time, Morgan allowed herself to feel the slightest flicker of victory. But as the shadows stretched long across the park, she knew this was only one battle won in a much larger war. The systems that allowed men like Hendrick to rise and thrive hadn't changed overnight. There were more people like him, more networks operating in the shadows, and it would be up to her and her team to continue breaking them down. The work wasn't over. Sarah's words echoed in her mind. Asterisk, at least Tank and his crew are off the streets. Asterisk Morgan's jaw tightened again as she thought of them. The gang that had terrorized so many, now facing their own consequences. While their cooperation had brought Hendrick down, Morgan wasn't ready to forgive them, not yet. They'd chosen their path, and now they would pay for it. It was a bitter truth, one that lingered in her gut, but it was also necessary. Their testimony had been the key, and that meant the world was just a little bit safer without them. Justice isn't always clean, Reyes had said earlier, and Morgan knew that was true. The reality of reduced sentences for Tank's crew weighed heavily on her, but she couldn't afford to lose sight of the bigger picture. Hendrick's conviction had sent a message, and it was a message that would reverberate through the system for years to come. The park was quiet now, the evening air crisp and cool. Morgan closed her eyes for a moment, letting the silence wrap around her. She'd faced the worst of it and kept going, and that was what mattered. For the victims, for the communities torn apart by fear and hate, and for herself. With a final glance at the fading sun, Morgan stood, her resolve steeled once more. The fight wasn't over. It would never be over. But for tonight, she had done what she came to do. And that was enough. As she walked away from the park, her thoughts turned to the future. The case is still ahead, the work left to do. There was always more to be done. Always more fights to fight. But with each victory, each step forward, she knew she was making a difference. And that was the only thing that kept her moving forward. Justice would never rest. Neither would she. As Morgan walked into the night, the battle had been won. But the war was far from over. Every step she took, every challenge she faced, reminded her that justice wasn't just a one-time victory. It was a continual fight against fear, hate, and corruption. If you've been inspired by Morgan's journey, her fight for justice, and her determination to bring those who abuse power to account, join the movement. Like, share, and subscribe to stay updated on more stories of courage, resilience, and the pursuit of justice. Let's keep the fight alive, because the world needs more people willing to stand up and make a difference. Together, we can make sure that the message is clear. Justice will not rest, and neither will we.